Hello everyone. I hope you can all hear me okay. My name is Spencer Allingham, and I'm the Regional Vice President and Technical Director at Condusiv Technologies for Europe, Middle East, and Africa. And today I'd like to introduce you to the Velocity software that you can use to speed up your SQL servers without having to reboot machines and without any SQL code changes being necessary. Now, before we get started, I just wanted to have you have a look in the GoToWebinar app that you have open on the screen. In the handouts section, I've put a few case studies and a Velocity data sheet as well. So as we're going through, if you want to get a little additional reading material, please do feel free to download those. It won't affect the main presentation, and then you can have a read afterwards. And in addition, there's a questions box. If you think of any questions as we're going through, please do feel free to type them in there, and I'll have a little Q&A section at the end and try and answer any questions that have come through. As far as I'm concerned, there's no such thing as a stupid question. So if you're thinking of a particular question, chances are somebody else is as well. So do feel free to put it into that box, and I will try and answer them at the end. All right. So to illustrate why you might want to consider downloading and installing the Velocity software onto your SQL servers, I ran some lab tests using HammerDB to generate an online transaction processing type workload with and without Velocity installed. Firstly, using SSD storage, and then using spinning disk storage. And as you can see from the metrics recorded by HammerDB, on SSD storage, there was about a 30% improvement in the number of SQL transactions that could be processed per minute. And this was backed up by Windows Perfmon metrics that showed a 28% improvement in transactions per second. And then when running the tests again using spinning hard drive storage, there was around 100% improvement. Now, either way, this is great news for SQL DBAs who care about the performance of the databases that are underpinning their business critical applications. Now, whether you're running SQL in a physical or virtualized environment or in the cloud, most SQL DBAs would welcome faster storage at a reasonable price. And Condusiv's Velocity software is designed to provide exactly that, but using the storage hardware that you already own. It doesn't matter if you have direct attached disks, if you're running a tiered SAN, have a tray of SSD storage, or are fortunate enough to have an all-flash array. That storage layer can be a limiting factor to your SQL database's productivity. The Velocity software reduces the amount of storage I/O traffic that has to go out and be processed by the disk storage layer, and streamlines or optimizes the data which does still have to go out to disk. The net result is that SQL can get more transactions completed in the same amount of time, quite simply because on average, it's not having to wait so much on the storage before being able to get on with its next transaction. Velocity can be downloaded and installed without any disruption whatsoever to live SQL servers. No SQL code changes are required and no reboots. Just simply install the software and typically you'll start seeing results in just a few minutes. Now, before we take a more in-depth look at that, I'd like to briefly mention that last year, the Velocity software was awarded the Microsoft SQL Server I/O Reliability Certification, which is quite a mouthful. But basically, this means that whilst providing faster storage access, Velocity didn't adversely affect the required and recommended behaviors that an I/O subsystem must provide for SQL, as defined by Microsoft themselves. Now, most SQL DBAs are familiar with why split pages are bad for performance. If you've got room and your update or insert doesn't require a split, this is pretty fast because SQL is just updating one page and then writing it out to disk and to the transaction log. But if the updated or inserted row doesn't fit, SQL needs to allocate a new page, move about half of the rows to the new page, and then write both pages to disk and to the transaction log. In addition, the pages and all the indexes that point to the data pages, well, they need to be updated too. So as an example, let's say that your table had one clustered index and 4 non-clustered indexes. That would mean at least 7 pages would need to be updated. You'd have 1 for the clustered index structure, 4 for the non-clustered indexes, and 2 in the data pages in the clustered index. So this page split would result in a minimum of 7 times the I/O as an insert or update that didn't require a page split. Now, each I/O that takes place takes a measurable amount of time and resource to process. And the same is true when the Windows file system splits data as it writes out to the logical NTFS volume. And that can have significant performance ramifications too. And this is basically why DBAs format volumes to be used by SQL with a 64K cluster size, rather than just leaving the NTFS default of just 4 kilobytes. It helps to avoid split I/O situations when writing to disk, and it keeps performance draining file fragmentation from building up so quickly. But it doesn't fix the problem though. As your NTFS file systems mature over time and files are created, extended, and deleted, the free space on the NTFS volume will become more and more fragmented into smaller and smaller free space extents, increasing those split I/O situations when you're trying to write out data. And each time your write is split in this way, the data gets sent out down to the disk storage layer in a separate I/O packet. And like split pages in SQL, each I/O takes a measurable amount of time and resource to process. So in the real world, a gigabyte of storage I/O traffic that should be written in, let's say, 2,000 or 3,000 I/Os could now be taking 30,000 or 40,000 I/Os to complete. And we call the performance penalty that these split I/O situations cause the Windows I/O tax, as in a tax on your performance due to split I/Os. In a virtualized environment, this performance penalty can be amplified by something called the I/O blender effect. And what's happening here is that you have small fractured storage I/O packets coming from the virtual machines. And as they get funneled through the hypervisor mixes these I/O streams together, causing a randomization effect. So what comes out between the physical host hypervisor, which could be VMware ESXi or Hyper-V, what comes out between that layer and the disk storage controller is now a chaotic mess of small, fractured, and now very randomized I/O streams that by the time they hit the storage controller, they couldn't be less storage friendly. It means that the storage controller is only receiving data in very small packets at a time, so it now only has the opportunity to create very small stripes across its media, and that means many more storage level operations than if that data hadn't been split as it was being written all the way up at that NTFS layer. Now, velocity helps Windows avoid or prevent most of the excess, unnecessary, performance-losing split I/O traffic and replaces it with far fewer storage I/O packets, each one carrying a larger payload of data. And this makes the movement of data between server and storage quite simply more efficient, much like avoiding page splits wherever possible. And it allows the disk storage to store the data using far fewer storage level operations. Velocity will also help create those nice large free space extents quietly and automatically in the background using only otherwise idle compute resources to make it easier for the Windows write driver to write into. So Think for a moment of a busy freeway or motorway at rush hour. Imagine that you've got lots of cars sitting bumper to bumper with just one person in each car, and none of them are getting anywhere very quickly. You can just see the miserable look on their faces. Now, imagine that each car on the motorway is a storage I/O packet, and each person in each car is your data. What the Velocity software is in effect doing is taking all of the people out of the cars and putting them in buses or coaches and removing all of the cars from the motorway, getting rid of that congestion so that now all of the people, or your data, can now flow to their destination in a much more efficient manner. I hope that makes sense. Good analogy, hopefully. But really, that's only half the story. Velocity also introduces an AI-fed RAM caching technique into the Windows operating system that further reduces the read I/O traffic that the backend storage has to deal with. The performance benefits provided are in addition to SQL's own buffering and any caching natively provided by the Windows operating system or further down the storage stack. And basically, this is how we could get 30% more SQL transactions done in the same amount of time during that testing that I mentioned before. Quite simply, SQL could get more work done in the same amount of time because it wasn't having to wait so much on the disk storage layer before being able to get on with its next transaction. And quite frankly, because RAM is faster than disk storage. Oh, and it absolutely works in both physical and virtualized SQL servers, and in the cloud as well. Storage I/O reduction, optimization, and RAM caching represent a significant reduction in workload that has to be processed by the backend storage. This is not only true of SQL Server storage traffic, but other workload types too. So in this example on the screen, let's say that the first VM is hosting SQL, and the second is hosting the application that interfaces with SQL, and the other two VMs are hosting busy file servers, and they're all sharing that same backend storage. You might have a situation where the traffic from the file servers are taxing the performance of SQL simply by keeping the storage layer busy. So SQL isn't necessarily the cause of the disk storage being slow, but it could be affected by the increased disk I/O queue depths and latency caused by those busy workloads on the file servers. So my recommendation would be install the Velocity software on all the Windows machines sharing that same backend storage, not just the SQL servers. That way, from the point of view of the storage, it's now simply doing the least amount of work, regardless of which VM is generating the most workload at any given time. Now, at this point, some of you might be thinking, yes, but SQL is already using most of the available memory in the machine. How could you possibly create a RAM cache? And that's a good question. It's a good point. It's true that if SQL is left uncapped, there typically wouldn't be enough RAM for our software to create a cache with. We've intentionally designed our software so that it can't compete for system resources with anything else that's running, so that we can never be the cause of a memory starvation situation. It would only use some of the free RAM that isn't being used by anything else, and it will dynamically size its cache, handing RAM back to Windows if other processes or applications need it. So for best results, you can easily cap the amount of RAM that SQL takes for its own form of caching or buffering. On busy database servers, if you leave 16 gig of RAM free, you'd have a Velocity cache size that would be enough to really make that machine's performance fly. And if you can't spare 16 gig, leave 8 gig. And if you can't afford 8 gig, leave 4 gig free. Even that is enough to make a difference. But if you go much smaller than that, the cache size would probably be a little too small, and the performance improvements would start to be limited. Now, you might also be thinking that, well, actually, SQL's buffering is good enough. So how does Velocity's caching complement this? And I have to be honest, at a basic level, SQL's caching does a pretty good job. And whilst that does have a positive impact on performance, Velocity's RAM caching is designed to eliminate the type of storage I/O traffic that tends to slow the storage down the most. And whilst that tends to be the smaller, more random read I/O traffic, actually that's not always the case. So Velocity uses a very lightweight storage filter driver to gather telemetry data. And this allows the software to learn useful things like what is the main application in use on the machine? What type of files are being accessed? And what type of storage I/O streams are being generated? And at what times of the day, the week, the month, the quarter? So it can use that machine learning technique to become very intelligent about what the hot blocks of data are that need to be in the RAM cache, and just as importantly, when. It can also use that telemetry to figure out how best to size the storage I/O packets to give the main application the best performance. If the way you use that machine changes over time, the Velocity software will automatically adapt to those changes without you having to reconfigure or tweak any settings. Now, validating results is really easy. First of all, you could measure the amount of SQL transactions being done each day to see if they increase. Some customers see reports that they generate take less time to produce, or SQL batch imports take less time, or other batch jobs complete more quickly. Some customers have even done a simple stopwatch test to measure things like record retrieval times. However, Velocity itself comes with very transparent reporting that will show you exactly how much storage I/O traffic it's able to eliminate from the disk storage layer. You can see what percentage of the reads and writes are being eliminated, and it'll show you how much storage time is being saved by the storage not having to process that eliminated I/O. That's time that's being freed up for you to use it for other things, additional workloads. Now, if you're using thin provisioned storage, Velocity can also help you reclaim space. So if you're using, for example, thin provisioned VMDK files in VMware or dynamic disks in Hyper-V, it can automatically zero out free space quietly in the background, so you don't have to wait for hours for an S-delete pass to complete when you need to reclaim some space. If you're thin provisioning down at the storage layer, maybe you've got a NetApp SAN or an HP 3PAR array, it can also send SCSI unmap commands down to the storage controller to notify it of blocks that are no longer needed and can be added back to the available pool. And that also works with vVols or virtual volumes in VMware as well. And if your virtual machines are provisioned with dynamically allocated RAM instead of a fixed amount of RAM, such that the hypervisor can borrow some back to reallocate to some other virtual machine, it's important for best results to make sure that you reserve enough RAM in your SQL VM's configuration for both SQL and Velocity. Otherwise, too much RAM in the VM could become driver locked by the hypervisor's ballooning driver, and that would mean that Velocity might not get enough RAM to cache with effectively. Now, I know that I'm speaking to an audience that's predominantly comprised of SQL experts rather than VMware or Hyper-V experts. But listen, we have very expert engineers that will be more than happy to jump on a call to help you with any of this type of stuff. Just get in contact with us and request that, and we'll be more than happy to help out. Now, these are just some of the case studies that you can access on our website at condusiv.com. As an example, Bell Mobility, on the bottom left there, they're a telecoms company in Canada who saw the Velocity software reduce the storage I/O traffic to their SAN by 61%. And this gave them SQL report queries that were 3 times faster, with no additional hardware being required. All they had to do was just install the software, which, as I mentioned earlier, is completely non-disruptive. There are no SQL code changes required, no reboots required, and zero disruption to the live running workloads. ASL Marketing in the middle, they saw their SQL batch imports drop from 27 hours to just 12 hours, a 15-hour reduction by simply installing the Velocity software. Suncoke Energy saw Velocity reduce the storage I/O traffic that had to go out to their storage array by 53%. That gave them faster data transfers and increased throughput on their Oracle workloads. Now, I know this is a SQL-focused webinar, but Velocity isn't just for SQL. It can be installed on any Windows computer to provide storage I/O reduction, optimization, and increased performance. Finally, on the top left, it's worth noting that Christus Health were able to cancel a $2 million SAN replacement simply because Velocity gave them back all of the performance they needed after they had virtualized. Saving money on storage hardware upgrades can really put a smile on even the most hardened finance directors' faces, and potentially could free up budget that you could then use elsewhere. Now, an easy way to tell if your Windows servers would benefit from the Velocity software is to use our free I/O assessment tool. And we're going to send a download link to this to everyone who's registered for the webinar. This can be used to easily monitor your workloads to search for and highlight performance bottlenecks, and it will indicate the potential for improvement with the Velocity software. And also, for a limited time, if you email us a copy of your I/O assessment tool report in the next 30 days, we can have one of our engineers step through this with you to provide additional expert analysis that's even more tailored to your specific IT environment and current needs. I like to think of this as an I/O bottleneck finder, and that's really what the tool is. Now, you may already have some other performance monitoring tool, but this is a little different, as it isn't, it's not showing real-time data. In fact, what the tool is doing is simply collecting and aggregating the system performance data that's already sitting in your Windows systems, whether they're virtual machines or physical servers. You don't have to install anything on any live servers. You just install on one machine that can see the computers that you want to monitor on the network. Oh, and of course, no reboots are required. Now, most people run the I/O assessment tool for a day or two, and at the end, the tool analyzes that data and puts in front of you a very easy to read report that shows you everything that the tool uncovered. So you can find out, do you have storage I/O issues or bottlenecks on your systems? And if you do, what the issues are, where they're occurring, and at what time of the day. It gives you a handy way to simply get empirical evidence on whether you have I/O issues in your IT environment or not. Hopefully not. Now, after the I/O assessment tool finishes running, as you can see, we list all the servers that have been measured, and we color code them depending on how badly they're being impacted by storage performance issues. Red systems are being critically impacted, yellow systems are being moderately impacted, and green systems are running actually just fine. And the tool is unique in that it has one measurement that no one else does, and this measures the I/O blender effect. This is where you have those storage I/Os coming from multiple machines at the same time, passing through a hypervisor and then on down to the storage. And when you have them coming at the same time, that can cause conflicts. This will measure that and tell you how much the I/O blender effect is affecting your environment. So firstly, I would encourage you to share what you've learned in this session with your colleagues. See what they have to say about this. Secondly, use the I/O assessment tool to non-disruptively and scientifically measure your potential for improvement. If your organization would benefit from faster data transfer rates using the storage hardware that you already own, I would urge you, just give us a try. You're not going to disrupt any live running workloads. You don't have to make any SQL code changes, and finding out for certain, frankly, will take no more than a few minutes to download and install and get running. Use the software to not only identify those servers that cause storage I/O issues, but let us help you make those issues go away. So I hope this has been interesting. Let's see if any questions have come through about the Velocity software itself or the free I/O assessment tool. Let's have a look. Just undock the Q&A box. So Anil asks, hello, do we get a copy of your presentation? Good question, Anil. Yes, you absolutely do. It'll either be later on today or first thing tomorrow. We will send out a copy of the slide deck that I've used, and I'm recording this session as well, so you'll get access to a copy of the recording. Hopefully I haven't bored you too much today, and you might want to review it again, or maybe even share with some of your colleagues, maybe some other SQL or Oracle DBAs. So yes, you will get that. Let's see. Anil also asks, the free I/O tool has got an end date, question mark. Yes, it does, but it will actually run for 6 months. So you've got plenty of time to use it on different systems. And when you do, I think I mentioned earlier, if you run it for 1 or 2 days, try and choose the machines that you feel are business critical or very busy, or VIP servers, or machines that the business cares about. Because if you have problems on those are the ones where you really want to try and get those problems resolved. Mukthia asks, is Velocity available for Linux? Good question. I'm afraid it's not. This is a Windows only solution. You can't install it onto a Linux OS, I'm afraid. I'm sorry about that. But for those of you that have a mixture of Linux machines and Windows machines that are sharing the backend storage, even though you can't install Velocity onto the Linux OS, it will still benefit indirectly, because if you put it onto those Windows machines, it will reduce the amount of storage I/O traffic going out to that shared storage layer as a customer average by 30 to 50%. So that means that the storage layer is working less hard. It'll help reduce storage I/O queue depths and help to reduce storage latency. And the Linux machine will then find more storage I/O headroom being handed back to the environment that it can take advantage of. It won't be slowed up as much by the storage I/O traffic from the Windows part of the estate. So sorry about that, Mukthia. We don't have it for Linux, but if you've got that hybrid type environment of the 2 operating systems, it's still definitely worth a look. So Jayakumar says, pretty much the same question. Is it going to work only for Windows, not Linux? Yes, I'm afraid it is only for Windows. We do have a Linux version on our long-term roadmap, but I'm afraid I don't know when that's going to be available for the public. And Anil says, does this tool work on high availability SQL? Yes, it does. The only caveat to that is if you are running an active Windows cluster, then it will disable the RAM caching by default, really to err on the side of caution. But you will still get benefit from avoiding those split IOs and the IO reduction that causes. But yes, it absolutely does work on high availability SQL. And then Anil says, thank you, informative presentation. Oh, that's nice. Thank you, Anil. I hope this has been useful. I think that's all of the questions that have come through. So we'll end up there unless any more comes through as I'm wrapping up. Please do use that IO assessment tool. It's a great place to start. It's not disruptive, and it will tell you if you need to use the Velocity software or not. We have 30-day trialware that's fully featured of the Velocity software as well. So if it does indicate that you would benefit from it, we can provide that to you as well. Not a problem. So yeah, give it a try and take advantage of that 30-day window to share those IO assessment tool reports with us. If you send it across to info@condusiv.co.uk, we'll assign an engineer, an expert in these things, to step through the report with you and really give you that additional insight and see if there are any performance issues, how badly they're affecting, and how much we are likely to be able to help you with that. But we can't do that if you don't share the reports with us. So let us know, and we'll do everything we can to honestly tell you whether we can boost performance or not. We'll certainly be honest about that. So, another question's come through from Marla. How is the licensing? Oh, that's a good question. So there are several different ways you can license the Velocity software. The simplest way of doing it is one license per machine. So one license per physical server, or one license per virtual machine, or you can even run it on Windows client operating systems as well. So if you've got, for example, a VDI environment with lots of Windows 7, Windows 8, or Windows 10 VMs for your users to use, you can get it for that as well. The most common way of licensing the software is to, certainly in a virtualized environment, is to buy a Velocity host license. So what that does is it licenses a physical host hypervisor. So let's say it's a VMware ESXi server or a Hyper-V server. And what that entitles you to is to put the software onto any and all Windows virtual machines that are being hosted by that physical host hypervisor. And then if you generate new virtual machines in the future, you're welcome to install the software onto those new machines as well, as long as they're being run in a licensed host. So I hope that helps. I think that's all of the questions that have come through. So Marla says, thanks, you're very welcome. Thank you to you all for giving me some of your time today. I know it's precious. I know you're all really busy, but I do hope this has been helpful. Please do let us know if we can help. And thank you, and have a very good rest of day. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.